Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So let's talk about globalization. First of all, what is globalization? Some people think of it as a phenomenon by which economic agents in any given part of the world are more affected by events elsewhere in the world than before. And there's plenty of evidence of this, particularly with financial crises that have occurred over the last 15 or 20 years. And even more so in the last couple of years, as of the time of this recording, summer of 2011. Other people look at globalization as the growing integration of the national economies of the world to the degree that we may be witnessing the emergence and operation of a single worldwide economy. It kind of blows your mind to think about the prospect of that, especially since, as of now, there are some people that are part of the European Union, they're in the Eurozone, that are questioning whether they should be still, with the Greek crisis weighing heavily on people in that zone as well as other parts of the world. But it seems like the evidence is suggesting that we are moving in this direction. Now, to envision globalization, there's a couple of things that you could do. Suppose, first of all, there were no physical, economic, or political barriers to trade between nations, and anyone can trade with anybody else no matter how far apart they were, 5,000 miles, 10,000 miles, no boundaries, no obstacles, at least not significantly. You could also envision globalization as turning the countries of the world into states of one overall country, like we have in the United States. Now, this isn't the first time we've experienced globalization. The first era of globalization occurred in the mid-1800s up into the late 1920s. But how do we know that globalization is taking place again? Well, first of all, there are some observations that we can make that support that globalization has been taking place. First, observing international trade. Tariff rates are way down over the last several years, and the volume of trade between countries is way up. Secondly, foreign exchange trading. The buying and selling of foreign currencies was 60 times higher in 1995 than it was in 1977. In 1992, the daily foreign exchange trading amounted to $820 billion. In 1998, not too long after that, that amount had risen to $1.5 trillion. And by 2007, over $3 trillion. A lot more trading of foreign exchange currency. Number 3, foreign direct investment. Also way up, as well as personal investment. In the case of the United States, a much bigger chunk today of the average American's stock portfolio is in stock of foreign companies than it was just 20-30 years ago. Also, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, has many more members today than it did 50 years ago. You can also observe business practices. The number of Americans working for foreign companies with offices right here in the United States has grown significantly in recent years. So, ample evidence to suggest that we are experiencing globalization. What are the reasons for this in the modern era? 1, the end to the Cold War. 2, advancing technology. During the first era, there were inventions like the internal combustion engine, steamship, telephone, telegraph. Now, it's these things that you almost take for granted. As a student, we consider you to be a digital native, somebody that has grown up with these kinds of technologies, the computer, the internet, and the cell phone. But people of my age and older typically are considered digital immigrants. We didn't have these things when we were your age. And at the risk of sounding old, these things are relatively new, and you take them for granted. But that's another reason for the era of modern globalization, as well as policy changes. Governments like China, India, and Russia, huge population bases, huge economies, have become more and more open to trade. Now, of course, there are people that are very supportive of globalization and people that are adamantly opposed to it. So what are some benefits of globalization? 1, comparative advantages can be exploited. And I don't use the word exploit in a negative sense. Think back to comparative advantage and the purest form of the theory. If countries are able to use their comparative advantage to trade with other countries, then With acceptable terms of trade, as you know, both countries can be better off and can consume more. Another benefit of globalization, income per person tends to rise. Between 1980 and 2000, the income per person doubled in India, and also a dramatic increase on average in China. Another benefit, lower prices. Prices of imports in particular tend to be lower over time the more globalization takes hold. Finally, productivity and innovation. There are many cases showing that companies that are subject to competition in the global marketplace, in order to compete, are more innovative and come up with better ways of being efficient and tapping into the market compared to those that don't face global competition. And this is supposed to generally benefit consumers. Now, what are some possible costs of globalization? One, increased income inequality. So although you have people like in China that on average are earning vastly more than they did 1 or 2 generations ago, those incomes are not dispersed evenly by any stretch. If you've watched the video with Hans Rosling showing the trends over the years of the growth of wealth and prosperity in countries around the globe, he, near the end of that video, focuses on China and the vast differences of standard of living for an average Chinese citizen depending on which province they live in. 100 years ago, people in rich countries had about 10 times more income than people in poor countries. Today, it's about 75 times more income. Another cost of globalization, net job loss. Although globalization has brought new jobs to the United States, more of them have been offshored. So, as a net gain or loss in the United States, and it's not the case in every country, we've had a net job loss. Offshoring, in case you haven't heard of this term before, is when work is done for a company by persons other than that original company's employees in a country other than the one in which the company is located. So they use certain kinds of workers, maybe specialized workers, to deal with a certain task because those workers come cheaper in another country. Another cost, more power to big corporations. The world's become much more corporatized, where large corporations have greater and greater influence. These corporations increasingly are international in nature. It's very difficult, even though they may have started in one country, to tell where their true home base is and what nationality they are, because depending on which branch offices you visit or which domestic corporate offices you visit, the faces, the cultural practices, the languages are more reflective of that geographic location. But corporations have become much more powerful and influential as a result of globalization, and they will make decisions and try to influence policy in their benefit, and not necessarily with the priority of doing what's best for the citizens of any one country, because by charter and by law, their first consideration is supposed to be profits, as opposed to governments. So now that you have all the information you need, you're equipped to use the various macro models to analyze situations and even predict the future. The typical order that you would be expected to analyze a situation for an AP macro FRQ is something like this. They give you a starting point. They say, all right, let's assume that the U.S. economy is currently at less than the long run level of employment or natural unemployment. Then there's a pivotal event. Once you show that starting point, typically with a graph, then you show the impact of the pivotal event. Maybe there's a supply shock, there's a change in demand, there's monetary, fiscal, or foreign exchange policy action that's taken by the government. Then you show the short-run effects of that government action or those shocks in whatever markets or aggregate supply and demand, if it applies to the home country, as well as secondary effects to other countries. Finally, you take a look at and explain the potential long-run effects of this event to the home country.